Have you ever had a friendship sour so badly that it tore a country apart? No? Well, let me tell you about two guys who did. Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or as we know him, Pompey the Great. These two were titans of Rome, once allies, even family. Caesar's daughter, Julia, was married to Pompey. They were the original power couple, part of the first Triumvirate with Crassus, basically running the Roman Republic. But then, everything went spectacularly wrong. Julia's tragic death in childbirth severed their most personal tie. Then Crassus, the money man and the buffer between them, was killed in a disastrous campaign in the east. Suddenly, the two most powerful men in Rome were left alone in the ring, and the ring wasn't big enough for both of them. The stage was set for one of the most epic showdowns in history, a conflict that would decide the fate of the Roman Republic itself. This is the story of how a political rivalry became a bloody civil war. So, what was the beef, really? It all boils down to power, politics, and a whole lot of ego. Caesar had just spent 8 years conquering Gaul, modern-day France. He was a military genius, fantastically wealthy from his conquests, and insanely popular with his soldiers and the common people of Rome. He was the celebrity general, the man of action. The Senate, however, was terrified of him. They saw a man with a private army, loyal only to him, a man who seemed to have no respect for their ancient traditions. They saw a potential king, and if there's one thing the Roman Republic hated, it was kings. On the other side, you had Pompey. He was the establishment's champion. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, won glorious victories in the east, and was seen as the defender of the Republic. The conservative senators, led by hardliners like Cato the Younger, flocked to Pompey. They saw him as their only hope to rein in the ambitious Caesar. They passed decrees demanding Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to face prosecution for alleged illegalities during his time as consul. Caesar knew this was a trap. Without his army, he'd be politically and physically vulnerable. He sent offers of compromise, even suggesting both he and Pompey give up their commands simultaneously. The Senate, egged on by Pompey's overconfidence, refused. They essentially told Caesar to surrender or be declared an enemy of the state. So, on a cold January day in 49 BC, Caesar stood before a small river called the Rubicon, the legal boundary of his province. To cross it with his army was an act of treason, an act of war. He hesitated, knowing the world would change forever once he stepped across. Then he uttered the famous words, Alea Iacta est. The die is cast. He crossed the Rubicon, and the civil war began. Caesar's advance was lightning fast. Town after town in Italy opened its gates to him without a fight. He had a reputation for clemency, often pardoning his captured opponents, which won him immense goodwill. Pompey and the majority of the Senate were completely caught off guard. They had expected Caesar to be bogged down, but instead he was practically on Rome's doorstep. In a state of panic, they abandoned Italy, fleeing across the Adriatic Sea to Greece to regroup and raise a larger army. Pompey controlled the seas and had the vast resources of the eastern provinces at his command. He believed he could starve Caesar out and crush him with overwhelming numbers. The first round went to Caesar, but the final battle was yet to come. After securing Italy and a quick, brilliant campaign in Spain to defeat Pompey's legions there, Caesar turned his attention to the main event, confronting Pompey himself in Greece. This is where things get truly dramatic. In the summer of 48 BC, the two armies finally faced each other near the city of Dyrrhachium. Pompey had a much larger force and a secure supply line. He built a massive line of fortifications and settled in for a siege, planning to starve Caesar's smaller veteran army into submission. For months, the two sides engaged in a strange war of walls and forts. Caesar's men were on the brink of starvation, reportedly reduced to eating bread made from a strange root. Against all odds, Caesar tried to blockade Pompey's larger army. It was an incredibly audacious plan that almost worked. However, Pompey eventually found a weak spot in Caesar's lines, broke through, and inflicted a serious defeat on Caesar's forces. For a moment, it looked like the war was over, Pompey's officers urged him to press the attack and annihilate Caesar's retreating army. But Pompey hesitated. He was a cautious general, and perhaps did not want to risk his advantage in a pitched battle against Caesar's desperate veterans. This hesitation would prove to be his greatest mistake. Caesar managed to escape, remarking that the enemy would have won today if they had a commander who knew how to win. The chase was on. Caesar retreated inland into the plains of Thessaly, luring Pompey away from his coastal supply lines. Pompey, pushed by his arrogant and overconfident senatorial allies who were tired of his cautious strategy, finally gave chase. They mocked him, calling him Agamemnon, King of Kings, because of all the important Romans in his camp. They were already arguing over who would get Caesar's prestigious position of Pontifex Maximus after he was defeated. They had no doubt about the outcome. They finally cornered Caesar near a town called Pharsalus. The numbers were laughably one-sided. Pompey had around 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had just 22,000 infantry and about 1,000 cavalry. It was more than 2 to 1. The morning of the battle, August 9th, 48 BC, Pompey's plan was simple and solid. He would use his massive cavalry advantage on his left flank to smash through Caesar's smaller cavalry force, then swing around and hit Caesar's legions from the rear. It was a classic hammer and anvil tactic. Victory seemed certain, but Caesar was no ordinary general. He anticipated Pompey's plan. He knew his cavalry couldn't stand up to a 7 to 1 disadvantage, so he did something brilliant and unorthodox. He secretly pulled out one cohort, a few hundred men, from each of his legions in the third line and formed a hidden fourth line of infantry behind his cavalry on the right flank. He instructed these men not to throw their javelins, but to use them as stabbing spears, aiming for the faces and eyes of the enemy cavalrymen. He told his main infantry lines to hold their ground and not charge until he gave the signal. The battle began. The legions clashed in the center with a terrifying roar of metal and men. As planned, Pompey's massive cavalry force charged. They easily swept aside Caesar's small cavalry, who put up a brief fight before feigning a retreat, drawing Pompey's horsemen further in. The Pompeian cavalry, smelling victory, lost all discipline and charged forward, eager to swing around and win the day. And that's when they ran straight into Caesar's hidden fourth line. Imagine the shock. These elite, aristocratic cavalrymen, charging headlong, suddenly confronted by a wall of disciplined legionaries who weren't throwing their spears, but jabbing them upwards into their faces and their horses' eyes. The psychological impact was devastating. The horses panicked, throwing their riders. The cavalry charge dissolved into chaos and terror. The once proud cavalry broke and fled the field, leaving the left flank of Pompey's infantry completely exposed. This was the moment Caesar had been waiting for. He signaled his fresh third line of legions to enter the fight, while his now unopposed cavalry swung around and crashed into Pompey's exposed flank and rear. Caught between the fresh assault from the front and the cavalry attack from behind, Pompey's legions buckled and then broke. The battle turned into a rout. From his command post, Pompey the Great watched his masterpiece plan, his career, and his world collapse in a matter of minutes. According to the historian Plutarch, when he saw his cavalry routed, he walked back to his camp like a man in a daze, sat in his tent, and said nothing. He had been utterly and completely outgeneraled. The Senate's champion, the man they thought was invincible, was broken. As Caesar's men stormed the camp, Pompey disguised himself and fled. The battle was a stunning, decisive victory for Caesar. His losses were minimal, perhaps a few hundred men. Pompey's army was shattered, with thousands killed and over 20,000 surrendering. Caesar, true to his policy of clemency, pardoned them all, including many senators who had fought against him, like Marcus Brutus. Pompey's flight ended in Egypt. He hoped to find refuge with the young king, Ptolemy the Thegned, whose father he had once helped. But the king's advisors saw only risk. They decided that siding with the loser was bad for business. As Pompey stepped ashore from a small boat, he was stabbed in the back and beheaded. When Caesar arrived a few days later in pursuit, he was presented with Pompey's head and signet ring. Far from being pleased, Caesar was reportedly disgusted and saddened by the undignified end of his great rival and former son-in-law. The Battle of Pharsalus didn't technically end the civil war, but it broke the back of the senatorial resistance. It was the ultimate showdown between two of Rome's greatest figures, a battle of wits and wills as much as swords and shields. Caesar's victory paved the way for him to become the undisputed master of Rome, effectively ending the 500-year-old Roman Republic and setting the stage for the Roman Empire. It all came down to one battle, one brilliant tactical move, and one general's fatal hesitation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to ancient Rome. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal battles, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next adventure. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was Caesar a hero or a villain? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious.